gospel reading today is from Matthew chapter 13. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. He who has ears, let him hear. The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" He replied, "The knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven have been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and he will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken from him. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will ever be hearing, but never understand. You will ever be seeing, but never perceive. For this people's hearts has been calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn, and then I would heal them. But blessed are your eyes because they see, and your ears because they hear. For I tell you the truth, many prophets and righteous men long to see what you see, but do not see it, and to hear what you hear, and do not hear it." These are the words of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Today I'm going to speak about cynicism, about cynical people, about being cynical, however you want to put it. I have noticed, hard to not notice, that we seem to be a cynical nation of cynical people. And I don't know what you do about that, but when I read this, I realized that Jesus seemed to be dealing with the same kind of problem. Because if there's anything about cynical people and a cynical nation, it's that they don't hear and they don't see. It doesn't matter what's said. The nature of cynicism is that you don't trust. And I got thinking, what does cynicism say about the groups or people that you're listening to, or that are speaking, or that you're cynical about? And what does it say about the person himself? And of course, I got to confess, I'm a bit of a cynic myself. So, I had to take the whole thing to heart. It became very, I don't know, it's probably these debates and that sort of thing, the whole political season as it begins to ramp up, that made it more and more obvious in light of the gospel message that brought it all to heart. But I looked at some recent surveys, and I saw that 30% of the people in the United States trust the Supreme Court. 29% trust the executive branch, that's the presidential branch of the government. And it's not just Obama. It's not that they trust or don't trust Obama. It's the president. It doesn't matter who the president is. It's the 29%. Wasn't any different when it was Bush. So it could be Republican or Democrat. It's 7% for Congress. Now, what does that say about them? What does it say about the Supreme Court? What does it say about the president? What does it say about Congress? Well, you're saying that either, this is in general, because you can talk about, okay, that's a survey, that's the attitude of the people of the United States, but they're individuals. So it says, what's the attitude of the individuals? So it's like 70% of the people think this about the Supreme Court, or 71% about the president, or 93% about Congress. I mean, it boggles my mind, 93%. Well, you're saying they think these people are one of two things. Either they have an agenda that is not in your better interests. They have an agenda. They're dishonest. They're basically dishonest people. You believe they're dishonest people, that they have some plan or some agenda that's not for you, that's not in your good for you. And they're lying about it. I mean, that's what you believe. Or you believe they're incompetent. I mean, it's one of those two things. They're just basically incompetent people, bumbling along and doing stupid things. Or they're smart people who are conspiring against you. I mean, those are one of two things that's believed. Of course, that's kind of a basic definition of being cynical. I don't know, that's really kind of, there's a certain sadness about that. But then I got thinking, well, what does that say about me or a cynical person? Where does that come from? And Jesus doesn't seem to be very kind to these people who are cynical. You know, he's saying this is a perverted generation, is what he calls them. I actually had brought to my mind, it gives away my age quite a bit, but the old Simon & Garfunkel song, right? You remember that, where you know, people talking without speaking, people listening without hearing, poets writing songs with voices never shared, no one dared disturb the sounds of silence. Sounds like nothing new, right, this whole idea. I was listening to an NPR the other day. It was Saturday. It was last Saturday, wasn't it? We did a work day at the church. Jason, was that when it was? I was riding home. I got about a 40-minute drive from the old church. We were doing a work day. And I got about a 40-minute drive, and I listened to NPR on the way home, and they were interviewing this guy. What was his name? Mike something or other. He's a head of Earth and Environmental Science at Columbia University. Very, very intelligent, very articulate gentleman, as you can imagine, being head of a department at a Columbia University, he would be. I was listening to him being interviewed, and I don't know how long the interview lasts, but I listened to him for probably a half hour. And as I listened, I realized the effect that he probably had on the people he was talking to. I enjoy listening to these kinds of things. I enjoy listening to intelligent people talk about a subject that they're very knowledgeable on. It doesn't matter whether I agree or disagree or what it is. I just enjoy hearing an intelligent person talk about something they really know. But he was talking about the problems in Syria now. These hundreds of thousands, I don't know, it's millions of people now who have been displaced. This horrible, horrible. And the people going into Europe and they're starving in the camps. Everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? I mean, I don't know how you could not know and still be, you know, alive. If you turn on TV, it's just an immense problem of these refugees, this huge refugee problem in Syria, coming out of Syria. And what caught my attention, and I thought, how do people react to this? Because it started out, he said, this is all caused by climate change. That was his premise. Yeah. His premise was that the entire refugee problem out of Syria is caused by climate change. And now recall, this guy is not dummy. He's very, very smart, articulate person. And I thought, well, how are people going to react to that statement up front? And I wonder how many people changed the station when they heard that. Right? Because there are, first of all, of course, this is NPR, of course, so it's, you know, pretty liberal audience to start with. So there's probably a group of people that immediately said, yeah, right on. The polar bears are starving and the refugees are dying and it's all climate change, right? The Al Gore bigots. You know, you got this group of people who, as far as they're concerned, all the problems in the world are climate change, right? And they probably didn't hear anything else. They turned off. didn't hear or see another thing. They heard the one thing they wanted to hear. And then you had the other group who, yeah, right. And the potholes in my road, and the, you know, then they click, and hear another thing, right? Because they turned the radio off or changed to a new channel or put in a CD or who knew, right? They weren't going to listen to another thing, right? Turned to Rush Limbaugh. That's the end of that one. Climate change. Right? But I immediately became fascinated. How in the world could anyone blame refugees on climate change? I mean, how do you get from here to there? As the first time I heard that, here's a very intelligent, articulated person who made this wild, to me, crazy statement. And I listened for the next half hour. Now, I got to say, he never once said man-made climate change. He never talked about any of the radical stuff. What he did was he went on to explain that Syria had this unstable, crazy government with a crazy dictator that was predictably that was suppressing their people, and they had gone through 3 years of drought in which they had crop failures and were beginning to starve, and that it was predictable under those types of unstable government conditions and climate change from good crop, good rain, good conditions to a drought conditions, that there would be a civil war, that someone who was paying attention to climate and geopolitical situations could have predicted a civil war, could have predicted what that dictator would do under those conditions, and could have predicted this refugee problem if they had included climate in their computations. It really was a well-presented and articulated proposal, theoretical proposal, that if they paid attention to climate, they could have been prepared for what occurred. All I'm saying is that being cynical prevents you from hearing and seeing truth. This gentleman was presenting, I think, a very logical truth. But our cynicism in both directions prevents us from seeing truth. Amen. And Jesus talks about that. He talks about a cynical generation. He was giving miracles. He was curing people. He was doing everything. He was preaching. You know, I've read secular literature from the first century of both Roman and Hebrew origin. And much of it proposes that they were sham artists, that these first century Christians were simply trying to bamboozle people for the purposes of making money and trickery. That this whole resurrection thing and all that was just, you know, this is a big sham. Well, come on. They were really lousy sham artists if they were, because they were all poor as church mice and having to hide and being persecuted, and they were being tortured and they were being killed. I don't know, I'd join that. I'm not the kind of bamboozle I'd get a part of. I'm the kind of pyramid scheme I'd join. Right? I mean, you're not paying attention. I mean, that's cynicism. You're just being cynical. They're not paying attention. They're not refusing to see and refusing to hear reality. Now, I've looked back at another thing. I thought it was interesting, because if we looked around, especially we looked at the kids that were here today, it's not true, especially if you look at this audience, that everybody here is a cynic. I thought, okay, so who are these people? Who are these people that are so cynical in our country? does this come from? And I really want to get back around to where it comes from, because I want to get back to the scripture. Where does the cynicism, what's the root in us? But I thought it'd be interesting to look at individuals. And we have, living in the United States today, 6 generations are alive today. 6 identifiable generations, because he speaks of the perverse generation, right? And these generations don't behave the same. A lot of you, I don't know if you think about it, but I don't know how many we have here of the great generation. I don't know how many of you are part of what's called the Great Generation. Of course, I remember the Great Generation. I'm not part of it. They were born in 1900 to 1930. Not too many of you guys left. Might be a few of you. Any of you here actually born before 1930? Nobody here born before 1930, huh? Oh, there we go. There's a member of the Great Generation. All right, well, yeah, there's another member of the Great Generation. You know why they're called the Great Generation? I'll tell you. They not only won the war, but they built this nation. The Great Generation built this nation. They did. It's an amazing feat. An amazing group of people. We can't hardly comprehend anymore what that generation did for this country. I just wrote down a few things so I wouldn't forget it. The Great Generation, not won the war, but they saved the world, literally saved the world, and built a nation. They were assertive, energetic, community-minded, always doers, and were excellent team players. Had a strong personal morality and a near absolute standard of right and wrong. Strong civic duty. Could almost guarantee they voted. Huge percentage of voters among that generation. Marriage was for life. Divorce out of wedlock, non-existent. You just didn't do it. Strong loyalty to jobs, group, and church. And when it came to their possessions, you used it, you fixed it, you used it up. And then you did without it if you didn't have it. And you bought things with cash. No debt. You saved up and you bought it with cash. An amazing generation. Then came the next generation, which is I'm part of. Probably most people here are. It's called the silent generation. It's an interesting name for it. They basically carried on the morals of the Great Generation. They were raised by that Great Generation, and so tended to have that same sense of marriage for life, no divorce. They had that instilled in them. There's not a lot to say about them. That's why they're called the silent generation. They kind of carried on. What they did more than anything else was accumulate a lot of wealth. And that probably is what ruined the Generation Xers that came next. Because the Generation Xers are the Vietnam generation, or the Me generation, right? A lot of names for it. They kind of self-righteous, self-centered, buy it now and use credit. These are all, of course, everybody's not the same, right? You can't cast everybody the same thing, but things really turned different in 1965 with that Generation X. And that's really where the cynicism comes in. That's really where it came from. They felt deserted. They were the two-earner generation. That's when the wife left home. That's when the kids became latchkey kids. That's when there was no longer any roots. Average 7 jobs per worker, no longer tied to a single job, no longer tied to a single location, huge credit card debt. As I said, they're totally unimpressed with authority, very skeptical. Everything changed with that generation. But they grew up with a lot of money from the previous generation. Then you had Generation Y, the millennials. And that's why we need to not get discouraged. You know, we all think, wow, last generation, next generation's gone to pot. Probably heard that, right? I've heard it from my parents. I thought of my kids. Of course, my kids were Generation Xers, so they did go to pot. But the millennials are turning out to be quite an amazing, in fact, they're beginning to be called the next great generation. Did you know that? They are. They're really turning into an amazing group of people, the millennials. They're serious-minded. They're have this new respect for authority. They're really give tremendous encouragement for the future. We need to, so maybe these boomers, these Generation Xers, didn't do all that terrible job, huh? Maybe they're raising kids that are really something. And then, of course, we have the little ones, right? You know what they're called? I love this. KGOYs. KGOYs. I don't even know if they pronounce it. I don't know how you pronounce it. Do you know why they're called KGOYs, since you have some of them? Some more over here. Well, you probably will appreciate it. Kids grow older young. Kids grow older young. KGOYs. The ones who were born after 9/11. They are growing up fast. Getting old fast. Compared to any other generation. They are consumer savvy. You don't pull the wool over their eyes. They aren't interested very long in toys. They are technology savvy like we can't even imagine. They are a completely different breed of animal, the KGOYs. We won't even recognize those kids when they get to be adults. They're going to be completely different. Of course, even the millennials are 24 by 7. They don't think in terms of day and night or weekend. The world is a 7 by 24 to them. 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. And the KGOYs are completely different. But it's a very encouraging turn of events. I've gone through that because I had generalized everybody into the cynicism thing, and I wanted to split it back out because generationally, the problem is that it's that group that are in control of the nation today, the group that's kind of running things today, or is that group who are highly cynical. And they're the ones who are highly influencing what we see on TV, what we see on Facebook, what we hear every day, what we read. Our world is affected heavily by this cynical activity. By the way, I don't know if I mentioned church or religious organizations are 54% distrusted. 54%. That's how cynical we are. Now I want to take it back to Scripture. Now Rob today did a Bible study. It was on Paul. And he was saying, I don't know how Paul kept it together with all he had to suffer. Paul was persecuted in ways we can't imagine, tortured. He spent most of his time in prison, for God's sake. The guy was really unbelievably bad, and yet his faith never wavered. At least as far as we can see, it never did. How did he do that? Yet we see we can't even trust people who write checks to us. Now, I talk to these people that are, I'm talking about people I consider kids. They're getting Social Security checks, living off the government. I try not to get irritated. I spent my whole life paying I paid maximum Social Security since I've been 16 years old. My whole life. I got these kids who are walking around and buying their stuff with food stamps and getting Social Security checks and griping. Trying to be loving. That's not anointing to. I don't think it'll work. You pay. It's not going to care, honestly. It's that they're ruining their lives. Someday they're going to be my age, they're going to look back and they haven't done anything. I mean, how sad to spend your whole life and not have done anything. Totally unproductive. What a terrible thing to have wasted a life. It comes down to something really simple. It really does, and highly scriptural. Where's your discernment? How are you discerning whether something is true or not true? How are you discerning whether this is something that should be listened to, or something that should be acceptable, or something that you should reject outright? Is it based upon your own prejudices, your own likes, your own dislikes, what's good for you or not good for you? In other words, are you your own God? Is it all about you? Because that's where cynicism resides. When I hear global change, lost the word there. Climate change, thank you. See what happens with age? Climate change. When I hear climate change, do I immediately say, okay, what is my opinion about climate change? How does that affect me? How should I, or do I turn to God? Is God the arbiter? Do I turn to God for each and everything? Is God my God? For Paul, God was God. God decided what he did and where he went. That's faith. God had faith that God would lead him true. It's that simple. He didn't have to decide whether it was good for him to go here or go there, whether it was the right thing for him to do this or do that. All he had to do was listen to God and know that whatever happened to him was God's will. He didn't have to worry about whether the Romans were doing the right thing or the Jews were doing the right thing, or whether he didn't have to do that. As long as he had faith that he was in God's will, he was fine. So are we skeptical because we know that we know best? And we're deciding things based on our desire for what's good for us. Is that what's right in life? Or is God Lord of our life? Is Jesus Lord of our life or not? It comes down to that. You simply have to ask Jesus into your life. Give your life to God. And then you don't have to worry about it. Amen? Amen. Jesus